So the question that we're dealing with is really sort of hairy, fuzzy, and both precise and not terribly precise. And it intersects across a lot of the different stakeholders and folks that are sitting here at the table, and then folks in the audience, of course, as well. To my mind, there are three things, and if I was a student taking notes, I'll say these up front so that you can stop paying attention in about 3 minutes. There are three things that we need to think about when we think about accountability and power and evidence. Is that fundamentally, to exercise accountability over power, we need evidence, we need good evidence. It's just not possible to hold somebody to account to something that you know nothing about. So sort of from an epistemological perspective, that's a core underpinning to the conversation. Secondly, information generation, evidence gathering are often public goods. They're diffuse benefits, few people specifically benefit, and therefore there is no clear political constituency to call for these sorts of things. And this is sort of traditional economics literature around market failures and the failure to provide public goods appropriately. So that's point number two. And then thirdly, decision-making for good information and evidence faces a lot of internal and external conflicts when we look at it in terms of public institutions generating this sort of stuff. And I'll use two examples to highlight this and relate this back to the real world. So if you're a student, you can now stop paying attention, because what works in theory only matters, not practice, at this stage. So if we think about a census that we might conduct in any given country, say, a country with strong democratic institutions like the US to another one where that might not be the case, it's kind of amazing, absurd even, that it happens, right? So every 10 years or so, a lot of money is spent, a lot of surveys go out, people gather a whole lot of information about things that determine democratic outcomes. So the size of your district, the number of people there, the kinds of people there, determine how votes are allocated, how power is distributed. And it's amazing that in many countries we're able to do this quite well. But it's also real that we're not able to do this very well at all in a lot of countries. And many developing countries, low-income countries in particular, face this problem, where you do not have regular censuses. And these are largely for the same problems that I described before, which is that they're public goods, there are a lot of conflicts within, say, the folks that would be using this sort of information to make decisions, and that there's very little good reason to do these things from, say, a political or power perspective if you're not being held to account. So a census, generally speaking, is administered by the state, and it deals with a constituency that isn't the most powerful. It is diffuse. And it is expensive in a way where if you're a decision maker, you could think about doing other things with that money. We have a friend and a colleague in the audience who spent a bit of time in Liberia, and an example that she gave to me once was that the entire budget for the Ag Ministry of Liberia is about $1 million a year. Now, if you add up, I don't know, the folks flying in and out of Liberia to do things from a development perspective, I'm sure it's more than $1 million. And so if Liberia is to, let's say, a country like Liberia, let's not say speak specifically to that one, if we're gonna have good development outcomes, we're gonna need to invest in the long term in long-haul public good problems. And the lack or absence of a census in a timely manner that's reliable, et cetera, would be problematic for power, for decision-making, for democratic outcomes, and in the end, development. And so that's sort of an overarching census example. To drill down deeply into something that I care about, very, very deeply, and there are many people, or a few people in the audience that know that I'm a little obsessed with this, SDG2. The little pin that I have right here. It's the goal to end hunger by 2030. And us, my colleagues at the foundation, alongside other bilateral donors and multilateral institutions, are thinking of what it is that we should do collectively together to make this happen, or at the very least figure out what our role or responsibility is towards its achievement, especially insofar as the commitments that we've already made are concerned. And some of the work that's being done, I think Jaron spoke to this earlier, is intended to inform decision-making in that context. And this is very specifically the nature sustainability special issue on smallholder productivity and income, doubling it by 2030 in a sustainable manner. From say, decision-making perspective, it's useful to have a coalition or synthesis of that sort of evidence in a volume that's digestible and can be used for decision-making. However, within this group that I described earlier, this group of bilateral donors and multilateral actors, a problem that we've very clearly identified at the outset is the lack of ag censuses. So in a lot of low-income sub-Saharan Africa, an ag census hasn't been done for 30, 40 years. And there are barely two points or two data points that we have on a lot of the core indicators that we think about or care about. And that includes productivity, that includes income, that includes poverty. And so if we're going to make evidence-based decisions, if we're going to hold folks to account, then we'll need this sort of information. And so an important problem for this group that I mentioned has been, how do we make this happen? What are the right set of incentives that we need in country? What are the right set of incentives that we need outside of country? What's the expertise that's needed? How do we bridge these different gaps? And this is a struggle. I was having fun conversations in the coffee break about this, about the struggle of the different actors, bringing them together at the table, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a very fundamental problem as far as democratic institutions are concerned. And this goes back to, if we can ladder back up to the theory of an ag census, generates a whole lot of information. It tells us what we need to know about what smallholders and other farmers are doing in country. But there's very little good reason to generate that sort of information. The benefits are diffuse. Smallholder farmers in particular are generally speaking not a vocal or active political constituency for most decision makers in developing countries. And it's very difficult for them even to ask for this specifically of those in power. So if you're a student and you're paying attention again, the one point that I would want to leave you with is that evidence and information is not something that's gathered from the ether. We need citizen and stakeholder buy-in over the long term to make this happen. Thank you.